Well, good morning, everyone. We are continuing through Genesis 45. And yesterday, we saw that Joseph teaches us about God's providence in verses 4 to 8. Now, we've seen God's providence in complete control this whole time so far. But in this passage, Joseph actually gives us a direct theological statement about God's providence, which we looked at yesterday. And as I noted, Joseph does that in order to reassure his brothers that he does actually forgive them. He really harbors no resentment or bitterness towards them, as we mentioned on Wednesday. And they need that reassurance. Remember, Judah has just given his genuine confession of their sin and offered himself as a substitute for Benjamin, which overwhelms Joseph. And he reveals himself to them. So let's read verses 1 to 3. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, so that all the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Now think for a moment how that would have hit you if you were one of Joseph's brothers. You're a little shocked. He just sent away all the Egyptians. And then he says, "I am Joseph." And all these thoughts begin to run through your mind. Did he just speak Hebrew? I didn't think he spoke Hebrew. He'd always been using an interpreter. Did he just say that he's Joseph? Nah. It can't be Joseph. Joseph's dead or enslaved somewhere. But then those Ishmaelite traders, they were on their way to Egypt, right? Nah, it can't be Joseph. But we never mentioned the name of our lost brother to him. How does he know it? Could this really be Joseph? Joseph has sovereign power. We're standing before the brother that we betrayed, unprotected in the heart of Pharaoh's palace. Oh no, we are in trouble. And so the text tells us they were dismayed at his presence. Joseph realizes this, so he knows that he's got to reassure his brothers. He's got to let them know that he really does forgive them. So he gives them a theological lesson in God's sovereignty to show why he is willing to forgive. He basically tells them that while they were the ones who sold him into slavery, God sent him and is in sovereign control the whole time. And he has a great and wonderful purpose for sending Joseph to Egypt. He basically tells them in his own words the promise that Jesus gives us through Paul in Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Giving them this lesson in God's providence shows them and us why he is able to forgive. You see, through all of his trials, Joseph has gained insight into God's providence, which breaks the cycle of vengeance and compels him to forgive. You see, there is no ground for retaliation when sins against us are placed in the big context of God's gracious and good plan for us. Joseph certainly acknowledges their crime, but the greater purpose of God's plan prevents him from seeking revenge. Trusting and accepting that purpose compels him and gives him the strength to forgive. This, by the way, shows us why right theology is practical and important to our lives. When a crisis hits or someone really hurts you by sinning greatly against you, the steps to forgive in some book somewhere, or sentimentality, or an emotional high, none of that will sustain you or help you. Only true biblical theology will keep you going. That's what helped Joseph endure for 13 years while he was a slave or in prison. It's what helped him not be consumed by all the power and wealth in the past 9 years in part of Pharaoh's court. And it's why he can use his human power to extend grace and forgiveness to his brothers, even now. Kids, when you know that someone has sinned greatly against you, and you know that that sin cannot destroy you because it is actually being used by God for your good, as Joseph says in verses 4 to 8 that we looked at yesterday, then you can begin to let go of the bitterness and the resentment and actually forgive. You can acknowledge their sin and not downplay it. We're not saying that we do that. This is what Joseph did. He didn't downplay their sin, but you can also extend forgiveness because you know that God overcomes that sin. You know, Joseph gives us another statement like this at the very end of the book in chapter 50, verse 20, where he says to his brothers, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Now, forgiveness for big sins isn't easy. I'm not trying to say that this is simple. But Joseph shows us that when we can look at the big picture of God's good and gracious plan for us, we can also find the strength to forgive. Now, you think about that, and I'll see you tomorrow.